The release of that new movie about trafficking everyone's talking about, I think it's important for us to recognize what most trafficking actually looks like.
A lot of people will say things like, hey, did you know that Joseph Smith married all these women? Some of them were as young as 14 years old. You'd be like, what? Are you kidding me? That sounds absolutely crazy.
Do you mean predatory? Because it's not just that he married girls as young as 14. It's also that he married people who worked in his own household, who were reliant on him for income or for housing.
Adding the context into it, you'd realize a couple things. You'd realize that first, while it's shocking for us in our day, back in his day, it was actually legal to marry a girl that was that young.
It's also legal to marry that young today in certain states in the United States. But it's not common, and it's definitely not normalized. So what was the average age of marriage in the U.S. in the 1800s? Between 1800 and 1900, women generally married for the first time between the ages of 20 and 22 years old. And for men, the average age was 26. As you can see, that's not a huge age gap. The age gap between 14-year-old Helen and 37-year-old Joseph Smith means he was old enough to be her father. But since we're talking about legality, was polygamy legal in Illinois back in the 1840s? No, it hasn't been legal since 1818.
Second, adding context, you'd realize that the proposal was actually done by her father.
In 1843, Apostle Heber C. Kimball had an important talk with his only daughter, 14-year-old Helen Mar. She wrote, "Without any preliminaries, my father asked me if I would believe him if he told me that it was right for married men to take other wives. The first impulse was anger. My sensibilities were painfully touched. I felt such a sense of personal injury and displeasure. For to mention such a thing to me, I thought altogether unworthy of my father, and as quick as he spoke, I replied to him short and emphatically, no, I wouldn't. This was the first time that I ever openly manifested anger towards him. Then he commenced talking seriously and reasoned and explained the principle and why it was again to be established upon the earth. This had a similar effect to a sudden shock of a small earthquake. Then father asked me if I would be sealed to Joseph and left me to reflect upon it. For the next 24 hours, known to Helen Mar, Heber and Joseph had already discussed the prospect of Helen becoming one of Joseph's wives. Heber now sought her agreement. Helen recalls, having a great desire to be connected with the prophet Joseph, he offered me to him. This I afterwards learned from the prophet's own mouth. My father had but one ewe lamb, but willingly laid her upon the altar. This is trafficking. It is textbook trafficking, and the way that it is usually done. It is usually done when someone that you trust, who you rely on, decides to use you in some way. In this case, he was using his daughter to get closer to the prophet. And then Joseph steps in and he promises her that this union will ensure her eternal salvation and exaltation for her entire father's household and all of her kindred.
It wasn't Joseph Smith who pins the 14 girl up against the wall and said, hey, you better marry me.
First, no one is saying this. Second, tell me you don't understand consent without telling me you don't understand consent.
Third, you would recognize that it was a sealing and not an actual marriage, and that there was no sexual involvement involved with Joseph Smith and this 14-year-old.
You don't know that. Did Joseph Smith have sexual relations with wives other than Emma? Though it is possible that Joseph had some marriages in which there were no sexual relations, there is no explicit or convincing evidence for this. And in a significant number of marriages, there is evidence for sexual relations. Don't believe Todd Compton? Let's look at what Richard Bushman says, who was a faithful member of the church. As the marriages increased, there were fewer and fewer opportunities for seeing each wife. Even so, nothing indicates that sexual relations were left out of plural marriage.
A lot of people say these things, and the automatic thing that we first think of is, oh, Joseph Smith is probably a pedophile, or he just wanted to do bad things with his girl, when in reality, no, that was not his intentions. So really, it all comes down to, what were the intentions of Joseph Smith?
You guys, he's being attacked because he's a man!